Yeah, all safe.
Thank you. I think we can start now. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening to all our participants joining from different parts of the world. A very warm welcome to all our participants and our eminent set of speakers today. Thank you for being with us. I am Disha Agarwal, Program Lead with the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Today, we celebrate the Global Wind Day and recognize that wind energy plays a very important role in meeting our energy demands and will continue to do so. Wind energy makes up 41% of India's grid-connected renewable energy capacity and is expected to grow more than 3.5 times the current levels by 2030. So this is significant. At CW, our constant endeavor is that we keep tracking the real-time developments in the renewable energy sector so that we can identify the challenges and constantly develop solutions to mitigate those challenges so that India can march ahead and reach its renewable energy targets and goals. The risks are continuously evolving, and accordingly, appropriate mitigation solutions also have to evolve. So we try and develop these mitigation solutions for discussions and deliberations such as today for adoption by a variety of stakeholders across the value chain. We observed one such key development in the wind sector in 2020. We saw that a significant and unanticipated drop in generation happened during the monsoon months of 2020. This is the time when wind sector generates the maximum power because the wind speeds are highest. Of course, the speeds are spread across the year as well. This led us to initiate a preliminary investigation of this event and examine the factors that led to this anomaly. And what implications can such events, if they occur in future, can have on the sector and system operations. Our investigation showed that the primary reasons for this fall in generation were a set of pre-monsoon weather anomalies that interplayed with the wind speeds and patterns. It is very much possible that this event was a one-off event or an aberration. However, the fact is that in this point in time, we don't know enough. We know that anomalous and extreme weather events are increasing every year. Just like we saw 2 cyclones in the last year, we are also seeing an increased frequency of cyclones this year. And so it is very important to analyze and assess the changes in climatic variables and their interplay with the wind speeds. So we must equip ourselves and gear up in time to develop these risk-proofing strategies. And surely we all believe that there are solutions which can be discussed and arrived at. With this motivation, CW partnered with ReConnect Energy Solutions, one of India's leading forecasting service providers and RE analytics firm, and started taking this research as a case study based approach. We are pleased to be partnering with them, and Vibhav from ReConnect is there also with us as part of this session. Thank you, Vibhav. We are also extremely thankful to Bloomberg Philanthropies. Thank you, Priya, for supporting this effort and all our renewable energy related research as well as other research across program areas of CW. I would also like to let you all know that we are taking this opportunity to briefly present our findings and recommendations today and listen and learn from our eminent set of speakers and accordingly refine our report that we will launch by the end of this month. With these words, I would again like to thank and extend a very warm welcome to all of you, particularly to our speakers. And with that, I hope for very interesting and insightful discussions. I'm really looking forward to this session. And I now invite Ms. Priya Shankar, India Director of the Climate and Environment Program at Bloomberg Philanthropies, to share her thoughts and perspectives with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Disha, and hello, everyone. On behalf of Bloomberg Philanthropies, I'd like to thank our partners at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water for organizing this webinar on the occasion of Global Wind Day, and Dr. Balaraman and other panelists here for joining us today, as well as all of those you that are tuning in to listen. For those of you that don't know us, Bloomberg Philanthropies is a nonprofit foundation set up by Michael Bloomberg, previously mayor of New York City and currently serving as United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Ambition and Solutions. We support work in 810 cities in 170 countries around the world, and a focus area of our work is the transition to renewable energy. Here in India, we're delighted to have a partnership with the International Solar Alliance, and also to be supporting analysis relevant for the energy transition, such as the study we'll discuss today. The growth of renewable energy, including wind energy in India, has been such an incredible success story globally. With over 39 gigawatts of wind power today, India has the fourth largest installed wind capacity in the world, and India has also succeeded in promoting domestic manufacturing and employment in the wind energy sector. We know that India has set ambitious targets of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030, of which wind energy will form a significant part. But even with the impressive strides already made, we also know that the estimated potential around wind energy is so much greater, with onshore wind potential of 300 gigawatts and offshore potential of 195 gigawatts. Wind energy brings enormous benefits. Today, it is, along with solar, among the cheapest sources of energy, making it cost competitive in many countries around the world, including India. Addressing climate change will require a rapid transition to renewable energy, including wind. And wind energy also brings benefits in terms of energy access and supply, jobs, economic growth, as well as health benefits through improved air quality. In India, wind energy offers 68,000 jobs already, and globally it offers more than 1 million jobs and has the potential to increase rapidly. Yet at the same time, the sector has faced challenges over the last year. Some of the challenges have been driven by the devastating COVID crisis, as with many other sectors. But some, as Disha mentioned, are related to wind speed variability and have been specific to the wind energy sector. In order for the wind sector to reach its potential, we need to understand and address these challenges. While wind energy is critical for addressing climate change, it appears that its potential may also be affected by climate change. The forthcoming analysis by CEW and ReConnect will help investigate these trends with an in-depth case study approach. I look forward to the presentation on the analysis and the broader discussions around what this might mean for the future of India's wind energy progress, which is critical for both India's sustainable development and for the wider world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Priya, for your encouraging words. I will now hand it over to Jay Shekhar. He is part of our renewable energy team at the Council. Jay, over to you for the briefing presentation, please.
Thank you, Disha. Thank you, Priya ma'am. Disha, I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen. You can put it in the slideshow mode, please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, one and all present here, respected speakers and attendees of the webinar. I take this opportunity to present one of CEW's most recent research findings in the wind energy space. The Council on Energy, Environment and Water is one of Asia's leading policy research institutions. We use data, integrated analysis, and strategic outreach to explain and change the use, reuse, and misuse of resources. CEEW has 7 focus areas and a Center of Energy Finance. Today, I, Jay, will present our most research findings to you. Wind energy has vast potential in India. There has been a steady growth in the Indian wind energy sector since 1985. Although in the peak season of 2020, India experienced a significant resource anomaly that led to a 24% lower generation value compared to 2019. Several states, including Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Maharashtra, faced large drops in wind power generation over the peak monsoon season, particularly in July. 4 out of 5 of the largest wind power producing states saw a generation decline by over 15% in 2020 in a year-on-year comparison with 2019. To assess the changing values of wind generation, we took a closer look at the regional level data, which helped us understand the phenomena from a more granular perspective. A comparison of daily wind power generation data over the past 3 years in Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Madhya Pradesh depicted a 28% decline in wind power generation during the peak monsoon season in a year-on-year comparison with 2019. Moreover, we identified a 14% drop in annual wind power generation too. Similar to our previous assessment, we compared annual wind power generation values over the last 2 years in the southern wind power producing states. Although South India did produce a higher generation value than the West in 2020, we noticed a 12.5% decline in wind power generation and an 8% decline in annual wind power generation in a year-on-year comparison with 2019. The Western region that houses almost 40% of India's installed wind capacity countered the drop in wind power generation by ramping up its hydropower generation by almost 12% between the period of June to August in 2020. The sudden changes in wind speed resources have implications for system operators at a regional and state level too. We found wind speeds were the primary cause of abrupt power generation changes in 2020. We assessed wind speeds over 2 massive wind farms in 2 of India's most winded states, which were Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, through our analysis. In Gujarat, we assessed wind speed patterns over the past 4 years in the Jamnagar region and noticed a subtle trend in declining wind speeds. That said, 2020 depicted daily average wind speeds that were visibly slower than daily average wind speeds in 2019 during the peak monsoon season, as depicted in the graph on your screen. In Tamil Nadu, we assessed wind speed patterns over the past 4 years in the Tirunelveli region. Here, we noticed a constant wind speed trend over the past 4 years, which showed no or less signs of drops in wind speeds. Wind speeds in the region in 2020 were fairly similar to what was expected in 2019, as a comparison of daily average wind speeds over the peak season depicted just a 5% decline in 2020 vis-a-vis 2019. Varying wind speeds fueled our interest to identify long-term wind speed patterns over Gujarat and Rajasthan and Tamil Nadu. Monthly average wind speed data from at 100-meter hub height from a period of 1979 to 2020 was used for this analysis. Clear signs of changing wind speeds were seen in Gujarat and Rajasthan, whereas Tamil Nadu depicted a relatively constant trend of wind speeds over the state. Changing wind speeds could have multiple impacts on the wind energy sector. And a few, and most certainly the most vulnerable segments include, first, the unanticipated change in cash flows during the peak monsoon season, which could also give rise to an increase in DSM charges for the nation. Second, unpredictable forecasts. In July 2020, gave rise to an abnormal increase in ramps in Tamil Nadu and Gujarat. And finally, regulatory impacts that span across multiple segments of power sector planning, execution, especially in winded states of India. Moving on. In 2020, what was probably an artificial influence on the climate system manifested a warmer than normal tropical ocean surrounding the Indian subcontinent. The meteorological signatures of the pre-monsoon season in 2020 indicated a weak monsoon. We identified the first being cooler than usual northern plains in the Indian subcontinent. Most of the northern Indian mainland was marginally cooler in 2020 compared to both the 1971 to 2000 monthly climatology and 2019. The 2020 pre-monsoon season was at its coolest since 1997. And second, rising sea surface temperatures of water bodies around India. The presence of a warmer than normal ocean surface next to India facilitated the formation of cyclones towards the tail end of the pre-monsoon season in 2020, which in turn facilitated a timely onset of weak monsoon winds, which formed due to reduced land-sea temperature gradients. Moving on. Growing concerns related to changing wind speeds over India motivated us to provide the industry with a few key recommendations that could better prepare various stakeholders to tackle the natural phenomena. The first being, updated resource maps could potentially assess climate risks in various regions perceived to be wind-rich in nature. Second, renewed forecast practices that would involve using forecasting tools that can anticipate anomalous wind events help strengthen decision-making and the management of weather-induced variabilities. Third, integrating wind uncertainty into planning by inducing adaptive grid integration policies. And lastly, but not the least, private and public organizations must also allow wind speed generation data availability at a more granular level to incentivize research hubs to assess foreseen threats to the wind energy sector. Although a deeper study to forecast the timelines of varying wind speed patterns is yet to be completed, we use this platform to initiate independent and insightful conversations. Thank you so much. Disha, hand over to you.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you so much. So as I mentioned earlier, this is our case study approach, which we took to look at 2020 in a little more detail. However, we would, going forward, if we have to assess the growing, either the intensity or probability of such events in the future, we need more long-term and rigorous climatological assessments and also other preparedness measures, which of course our panelists can discuss about going forward. I would now like to invite Dr. Balaraman, who is the Director General at the National Institute of Wind Energy, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, the Government of India. He has over 28 years of deep experience in power systems engineering and specializes in renewable energy integration, system plannings and operations, and solving intricate customer problems. Over to you, Dr. Balaraman. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you. We'd like to learn from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Disha, and good afternoon to all the panel members and also all the participants. And first of all, my greetings to all on the Global Wind Day celebrations. Okay, June 15th is a Global Wind Day. It is celebrated every year. And this year, again, we are celebrating on highlighting what are issues are there, how to overcome. And this is a platform where we can discuss what has happened and what's to be done in the future. It's a good type what Jay has presented it. And let us see what to be done and how to move forward on that. And just to give a brief glance of wind sector in the country, we have more than 3 decades of successful wind generation track record in our country. And the manufacturing sector of the wind is ranged from 250 kilowatts up to 3 megawatts. And we are very successful. And we had more than 85%, some of the models I got more than 85% of the make in India. And this is purely, I could say, a make in India product, the wind generation part of it. And we are also one of the high quality, at the same time, the lowest cost wind turbine in the world, as per the latest techno report. So we have very good ecosystem and we have very good supply chain in the component manufacture till recently. And of course, with the last few years of the crisscrossing, there are few supply chains have been disrupted, but otherwise we have a very good supply chain in the manufacturing sector. And a hub height, which has started from 26 meters to start with, now we have more than 140 meters going up to 150 meters hub height. And the rotor diameter ranging from 16 meters we start with, and now we are having 140 to 150 meters. And annual CEF, which is used to be between 15 to 20%, today we talk about more than 35% CEF. So these are the kind of things what we evolved in the last 3 decades. And we have a very good track record both in the R&D spectrum as well as the analysis part of it. Now coming to the ReGeneration. So every ReGeneration has to be dependent on the nature and specifically the weather pattern. Be it a wind, solar or hydro, everything is going to depend on weather. And the weather pattern, if you try to talk about long-term weather pattern, the weather pattern typically exhibits some kind of a cyclical nature. The cyclical nature ranges from 5 years to 10 years, sometimes to 15 year cycle also. So this is a kind of a cycle we could see. Even in the wind speed also, we could see a cycle of roughly between 6 years to 9 years, we could see a cycle. So this kind of a cycle is getting repeating in the wind sector, and also in the hydro, we are trying to talk about every 5 to 6 years, every hydro cycle can be repeated. There's a long range study what has been done. Of course, there's a lot of needs to be done on the particular aspect of it. And of course, if you see the last few years, at least from 2010 onwards, a lot of studies have been come up, both in the Nature's magazine and other studies, indicating the changes in the generation profile of the RE, be it wind, be it solar, even in hydro also. There are a lot of predictions been happen. Some of the predictions have come true, some of the predictions way out the mark, and a lot of things have happened. Some of the studies now they are talking about an increase in generation because of climate change, in particular in the Europe. They're predicting almost like 10% increase in the wind generation in the European region because of the 1.5% change in the temperature effects. And similarly, they're trying to talk about with a kind of the trend going on, particularly with the aerosols and other climatic changes, the solar generation is coming down. So this is also another trend being reported by some of the studies. So these are the studies we are trying to talk about, and particularly we see in the recent years a lot of studies coming up. And if you talk about all these kind of studies, we try to see very clearly that everything is going to depend on the data. And this is very, very critical for us to understand how the data is getting concentrated, how reliable this data is going to be. If we try to talk about historical data, most of the historical data today, what we have is based on the meteorological or the weather-related studies, not with respect to what we are trying to talk about the solar generation or wind generation, because these are all very recent phenomena, particularly if we're talking about the weather pattern part of it. So if we try to talk about the long-term induced any kind of a measurements, we are trying to relay at least 50 to 100 years of data, a consistent data what is required, if at all you want to come to any meaningful conclusions. So I would say any kind of statistical part of it, less than 50 years data, if you're trying to rely on any kind of analysis and doing any kind of prediction, is not going to give any kind of a meaningful result to you. And of course, the data what we are trying to talk about today, that's saying from 1970s, we are trying to see the decrease in the wind speed. Please remember, most of this data is at a height of 10 meters. And these are the locations wherein, for a period of time, what used to be the remote area, it has come to the city center, and the 10 meters height where you're going to measure the wind speed has got its own kind of uncertainty. I use the word uncertainty, wherein the measurement cycle, how we are trying to talk about. So if you are trying to talk based on this 10 meters of data to what we are trying to talk about 140 meters or 150 meters of the wind generation data, I really keep my finger crossed on that particular aspect. And now we'll try to talk about year 2020, the case study part of it, what you really picked up. So if you try to talk about, already it has been presented, a 30% drop in the wind generation, and overall there's going to be around 10% drop. Definitely, but whether it is a sudden, I have to differ on this particular one. In fact, my friend Sunil Jain could concur with me. We had the same discussion there last year, May 2020. We had a debate on that. This year, we see the unusual wind pattern, the generation coming down. In fact, our team picked up in the late April, predicting that because we are doing the wind forecasting for from 2015 onwards. And when we analyze this data, we could see a pattern where the generation has come down. And we also said very clearly in the month of April, May, we said this year the generation around 25% is going to be dropping. And we also said very clearly as a challenge, of course, because since we are relying on abstract modeling for a medium term, long term, we also say based on the past trend, the generation can go beyond November, December also. So overall, if you can see that kind of prediction, of course, our prediction has come true, and the generation went up to the late December also, where it is picked up, and we could see the loss in generation less, even though the winter started late. And this year, we picked up in the month of April, so we could pick up saying very clearly generation is good. And this year, we could see in the month of April, we got a good generation, and the May is also a good generation, what you are seeing here. Now, coming to any kind of a statistical event we try to talk about, an event, whether to classify it as an outlier or to be classifying it as any natural phenomena, or you're talking about predictable pattern, or to be taken as a reference for the future case studies. Now, coming to this particular one, I don't want to classify this as an outlier because outlier is the one which we cannot predict in advance. So since we could predict in advance, definitely I don't call it an outlier, but rather I talk about the natural weather cycle. So it's a part of natural weather cycle which won't be repeating every 7 years or 9 years or 11 years as a case may be, it is going to happen. That especially has happened if you try to talk about the 2021 case as of today. In the month of April, in Tamil Nadu has picked up the wind generation in the early April itself. So we could see almost close to around 20% increase in generation. Overall in the country, there's a 8% compared to 2019. I'm not talking 2020 visitor, the outlier kind of a thing. Compared to 2019, the generation is 8% higher in 2019 overall in the country. And if you talk about in the month of May, compared to 2019, 2021 is more or less same with a marginal increase in the wind generation, what you could see in the month of May. Whether it's going to sustain for June and July, yeah, definitely there's a lot of other factors going to be depending on. And also we could see a clear shift in the generation profile from the southern states to the western states. So there's some kind of phenomenon is happening between the southern state to the western states, which need to be clearly picked up. Now, coming to this particular aspect of it, 2020, how you need to start working on that. Definitely, if you try to talk about in any of our wind study, when you talk of P90 or P50 calculations, we try to take it about uncertainties. These uncertainties are going to take into account how we are going to talk about. And also what we did is we did a study of going for a 10 years moving average. So we did pick up we have the wind mast in Kayatha. We had the data for almost like 3 decades, we have the data. We tried to move forward with the 10 years moving average. We could see typically around 1.2 to 1.3 cycles getting repeated in the 10-year cycle. That means the cycle can be lying between 7 years to 8 years, something like that. So yes, there is a pattern getting repeated. And as you are trying to talk about whether the wind speeds are coming down in the Indian Peninsula, as on today, I keep my finger crossed, the data is mixed and the outcome, depending upon how we want to interpret the data, some studies indicating there's an increase in generation, that particularly you're talking about 2030 or 2040 scenario. Some of the things they are trying to talk about very clearly picture saying that no, the wind itself is going to be a big challenge in the future. So on both the sides, I want to differ. I would say very clearly what we have to do as a moving way forward is we need to start working on having a long-term data at a credible height of say 100 meters so that we can start analyzing. And let us not having the same kind of debate in 2030 or 2040 and a phenomena. Let us have a very clear implication on this particular one. And next very important thing is this is where we want to start it. We already started in 2020 to have a medium-term, long-term wind forecasting, wind and solar forecasting. Solar, we have a consistent data for the last 10 years at close to around 120 locations. Whereas a wind, we don't have a long-term data on a particular location. Of course, we have the locations, these are locations 2 to 3 years of data, and some kind of the private developers do have some of the data. This is where I would definitely urge all the industries and all the stakeholders to come together to create a platform for forecasting the medium term and long term, the generation, not just I'm talking wind, including solar also, because wind and solar is going to be the mainstay for the future in the country. So we need to have analysis on both the wind and solar. And of course, I could assure you that NIVE can definitely take a leadership role because we already established the Center of Excellence in Forecasting, and also we have established Center of Excellence in the Data Analytics on the RE. So definitely we can lead from the front, but we do need additional data. We need to have the industrial partnership to move forward because it is going to be an important issue as we move towards a transition to the clean energy, and it's a must. I stop here because you have given me 10 minutes time, so I can go on talking on the subject, but I'll stop here now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Balaraman, for sharing your perspectives, insights, and your experience in dealing with the wind power and RE integration issues for so many years. We really welcome your proposal on the better data availability. So it will be really also very useful for researchers like us to look at the real wind data to see how, and also plant level disaggregated generation data will be really important because right now we only get aggregated data. So we're not able to figure out the capacity changes that might happen year-on-year basis. So this is something that we also highlight in some of our recommendations. It'd be really good to hear some of the panelists around this aspect as well during the panel. Thank you, Dr. Balaraman. We will now move forward with our panel discussion. It will be moderated by Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, CEO, Council on Energy, Environment and Water. I will just take a few minutes to introduce the eminent the set of speakers we have today. So we have Mr. Sunil Jain. He's the former president of the Wind Independent Power Producers Association. He is a renewable energy industry leader and has successfully led two organizations, namely Hero Future Energies and Sembcorp Green Infra. He's also credited with setting up more than 3 gigawatts of capacity of wind and solar power generation on ground. He has over 3 decades of experience spanning across automotive, infrastructure, and clean tech and manufacturing industries. Next, we have Ms. Randy Christiansen. She is an economics and financial analyst at the International Energy Agency. She works with the Renewable Integration and Secure Electricity Division at the IEA. She works on power system flexibility, market reform, and cross-border trading. Before joining the IEA, she worked in the market development department at the Danish transmission system operator. She has 10 years of experience in trading power, coal, gas, and electricity certificates in various European markets and structuring corporate PPAs for renewables. Next, we have Mr. Vibhav Noel, who's also from ReConnect Energies, the director and co-founder at ReConnect, and also a partner organization for this research. ReConnect Energy is India's largest renewable energy analytics firm. He's an MBA from Columbia University and is passionate about sustainability and climate change. In the last 10 years, he's worked very closely with policymakers and regulators in India to shape the policies in the energy landscape. I extend a very warm welcome to all of you, and I hand it over to you, Arunava, now to initiate the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Disha. And first of all, let me extend my warm welcome to all of you for what I believe is a very important discussion. So thank you for joining us. I can see there are more than 200 participants. I would believe that many of you are from industry. You are trying to literally catch the wind for India's renewable energy rollout. So thank you for joining in this conversation. Thank you, Dr. Balaraman, for your leadership and Nive's leadership, because without your analytics and your forecasting, the foundations of the industry remain much weaker. So you play such a critical role in creating that ecosystem. So I'm going to dive straight into this conversation. And thanks, Disha and Jay, for your research and my colleagues. In fact, before I carry on with the other questions, perhaps Jay and Disha, there are some questions coming up in the Q&A. Whatever you can answer, please do answer, and I will try to come back to them as well. Just over 2 years ago, in May 2019, I wrote a column headlined Save Wind Energy from the Doldrums. But at that time, I used the term doldrums not in its literal sense, but what I perceived at that time to be a little bit of policy uncertainty that was slowing down the pace of wind energy deployment in the country. Doldrums, of course, are a natural phenomenon wherein you suddenly get periods of light or low wind speeds. Little did I know that 13 months after I wrote that column, we would be actually faced, at least with a temporary doldrums in the context of wind speeds that Indian projects were experiencing. But of course, as we've shown, just like one swallow does not make a summer, one or a few months of low wind speed should not be used as a reason to say all is destroyed in the Indian wind sector. There is increasing interest, nearly 40,000 megawatts deployed, 60,000 megawatts is the target for 2022, 140,000 megawatts is the target for 2030. So we have a long way to go. So that's why I think a conversation like this is important, because when we use the phrase renewable energy, what is the first thing that comes to mind? So this resource is renewable, that we should worry about everything, but we should not worry about the resource. As opposed to any other form of energy, where it is the resource that is finite, it is the resource that you have to go looking for. And India, of course, has high wind speed areas, low wind speed areas. We've got massive deployment in Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, the kind of high wind speed areas, but there are also policy opportunities to encourage investment in low wind speed areas. But what happens when high wind speed areas have at least, a sudden dip in those wind speeds? So in addition to the natural resource, which we tend to take for granted, there are two other actors here: the developers and the investors. And of course, taking it all together is the government. So that's what makes a market. Right? So when we expect developers to come forward and build at higher heights and build more capacity, and we expect investors to put in their equity or extend debt, we hope that broadly it's not just the predictability of the wind speeds, but it's the broader predictability of where the market is going and the sector is developing that becomes important. And it's in that backdrop that we should recognize why, at least we felt, there was a fair degree of concern from industry last summer, because suddenly one of the variables, or rather one of the constants in their equations, became a variable as well. And that's what impacts IRRs, that's what impacts debt servicing, and so forth. So let me jump straight into this and welcome one of the industry leaders. Disha has already introduced Mr. Sunil Jain, but if I can simply say that his plain speaking is extremely welcome and has been an important voice in making sure that industry concerns are brought to the fore, and so that once they are addressed, the industry, not just the companies he has led, but others can benefit from Mr. Jain's plain speaking. So Mr. Jain, let me come to you first. How did industry cope with the low wind power generation during the monsoon of 2020? And what were the response mechanisms that the companies, including the one you were heading at the time, put in place? Was this predicted? Do you have, let me put it this way, do you have scenario planning of if some things like that happen, what do you do? So give us an industry insider view of what went on last summer.
Good afternoon, everybody. And CW, thank you for having me on this panel. Well, I go back to last year when, I discussed about this issue with both Dr. Balaraman and Arunava of what we have faced. But let me step a little back. My view is that whatever phenomena we saw in 2021 was bound to happen someday or the other. Because if you see the trend for last few years, it was quite visible. In fact, that is what was actually predictable, that the wind is going down. The only thing was that it went down too sharply in a span of 4 months. Probably that can be a one-off phenomena. So I have been observing, and I've been one of those early ones in the wind industry from 2007, and I've seen those heydays of bumper winds. When I could get 100% PLF from my turbines, or even 102% in Tamil Nadu. I've seen those days. So these kind of drops have been happening. If you see, 18 was X, then 19 was X minus Y, and then 20 was X minus 2Y. And and 21, 22 is not going to be any better, as I'm seeing now. So what do we do? And what you ask me, how do you plan? Or how the companies are planning? So now, any investment which goes into the wind, an investor typically invests at a P75 level of the study what we have done. Whereas a a lender, at least in India, comes at a P90 level, although he may do his sensitivity at P99 also. European lenders would always come at P99. So they are almost saying that that is the probability. But this time around, even that P99 was breached. We had crossed P100 also. So you understand the problem that even if the probability of event occurring, that generation happening was 100, we surpassed that also. It did not happen. So we could pass it on as a one-off event. So what happens is, how does the investor get impacted or the company operating the project gets impacted? It's got 2 or 3 things to be done. One, my biggest concern is, forget about the equity investors' return. My biggest concern is I should not default to my lenders. That's my first concern. And therefore, everybody scrambles to see from where you can get the money. Because what happens is, if your 4-month peak season drops, you are finished for the entire year. Because that cash generation of 4 months actually stays good to you for the entire year. That's how you service your loan for the entire year in case of it. If those 4 or 5 months are gone, even if the other months are on dot, you will not be able to service your debt. So that is the biggest concern for the investors. What you do is you go back to the banks and say, okay, you give me some more limits so that I can pay off your loans. Or the equity investor puts in his capital. And it even becomes worse when your utilities don't pay you on time. So you got a double whammy. Now coming to, okay, you handled this. Now let me come to the operations part. And my friend Vibhav, who's been one of our vendors for forecasting, the sudden variations and sudden drops actually impacts the forecasting. And the new law, the penalties are quite severe. And effectively what you have done is, in these kind of low tariff regimes of 2 rupees 60, 70 paisa, if a 5 paisa is shaved off on account of scheduling forecast, extra 5 paisa, you do provide for 3, 4 paisa, but this is beyond that. If that is shaved off, 1 year loss of this project returns is going to impact you for next 4 years. But this is something what we cannot do. But one thing what I believe, with all the satellite weather data and everything, this country definitely needs far more weather stations at respective places where we believe that wind farms and the renewable farms are going to come. That is what we are lucky. We've got some, Dr. Balram can correct me, or even you people will be knowing, we've got some 567 weather stations. And if I am not wrong, half of them don't work accurately. And for people to predict and project the energy or wind, and in turn predict the generation and delivery, those weather stations are very important. Yes, satellite data is good, but the point data is very important. Number 3. Now, this was from the investor's point of view. Now, let's look at it from the utilities point of view. You don't predict right, his grid becomes unstable. Number 2, your generation drops. He's not able to fulfill his RPO obligation. So he has a penalty on that. What he does is, there is a clause in the power purchase agreement that if you don't fulfill your generation, we'll penalize you. So there is a whole lot of uncertainty and instability in the sector just in 1 year. But one could discount that as a one-off phenomena, provided the impact of climate change, we just close our eyes. I think so. I've seen it over the last 14 years. And let me tell you this, I have seen a clear case of climate change, especially for wind. And maybe next year we should be talking about solar, because I've already seen a downward trend in solar also. This year, the solar generation for April, May, and part of June is already down by 3.5% because of cloudy conditions. So what I'm trying to say is that at the end of the day, it is the investor who's going to suffer, and partially the utilities. And until or unless we do more data analysis and more prediction on the climate change, I think so what needs to be done is that everybody has to collaborate and cooperate. CEW or any other climate change forecasters, ReConnect Energy, and the investors. Everybody has to start sharing the data. That's what Dr. Balram was saying. And probably if it required, and if people don't want to share the data for fear of leakage of data. And also there is a concern, that, oh, if my investor knows that my sites are not doing well, what will happen? So people don't share the data. But I don't think so that's the case. Government should ensure that data is shared. What government has already started in Badla Solar Park, you can see online data of all the generation of all the plants. That should be done. The data is available. That will actually help investors and the developers themselves. So then you will be able to predict better. And maybe you can talk to your bankers and say that how you can, change the repayment cycles of the loans. We are not saying that you default. You will pay them, but maybe you can tweak it so that everybody is at ease. But climate change is here. The weathers are cool, and I have data for 18, 19, 19, 20, 20, 21. Every year it has started declining. Yes, 2021 was a bad year, aberration. I hope so, and I wish so. But 21 June data, first 15 days is not great. The May was good because of cyclonic impact. So, everybody benefited from that May data.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jain. Those are very interesting step-by-step points, and we'll come back to some of those critical policy interventions as well as financial interventions in a second. But let me jump across to Randy Christensen. Randy, first of all, many thanks for joining us. You have extensive experience in this area. I'm wondering whether you're looking at India and saying deja vu, because it seems that European developers have also struggled with a fair degree of uncertainty in wind power production in the past. So because of either extreme weather events or abnormal, weather cycles. So again, from what you've seen across Europe, how have wind developers and more broadly the power system operators coped with this? I mean, just to give an example, just to put it in context, this morning's news was that the longest ever undersea cable is about to get operationalized between the UK and Norway. And the UK will sell offshore wind power to Norway, and Norway will sell hydropower to the UK. India also obviously has interest in integrating its electricity system with its neighboring countries and so forth. But again, all of that is contingent in being able to predict the power generation. So tell us the European experience and how have developers dealt with these issues there.
First of all, I would like to say thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I think it's a very, very important discussion, and it's important to highlight the specificities in the individual countries. As you mentioned, I do have quite extensive experience with wind. Wind is very close to my heart because when I started out in the energy business, I actually started with trading wind, short term, but also longer term in terms of securing cash flows. This also means that I have extensive experience talking to investors who suddenly see that the cash flows of their investment is not what they thought it would be. Because wind is really inherently very, very volatile in terms of production. And when you look at output, it's very, very normal to see individual months that are down to index 40 and so on. So when you look at the year, you can still have years that go down to index 80, for example, and that is a very, very troublesome scenario for investors. You do also see the reverse where you have very, very good wind years, but I do also take the point of all the esteemed speakers before me that there is a trend in this one for India especially. I will say in Northern Europe especially, wind developed relatively steadily over many years. So it makes a little bit of a difference to what you're seeing in India, where you have a massive boom of renewables coming in. So in my country, I come from Denmark. We started already in the 90s with putting up wind turbines. And the people who actually invested in the wind turbines were farmers. And the farmers are inherently used to weather risk. So it was less of a shock that this would actually impact their investment. When you now see that big pension funds and what have you not start to invest in renewables, they're taking on a risk, weather risk, that is something that they're actually not used to, and it really surprises them. So I will say from an investment perspective, it's really, really important to understand what is the asset you're actually investing in, be it hydro, be it wind, be it solar, being it a thermal asset, because it does really have different risk profiles. And understanding that in terms of how you structure your financing is really, really important. So to me, there's three main categories of risk I would look at. There's a really long-term risk which is a systematic risk of adequacy. So when you do your energy planning, if you overrate your renewables, are you then suddenly in a situation where if you have a bad wind month or a quarter or year, that you're actually lacking the ability to service your energy demand? Right. That is obviously a very long-term integrated planning view that you have to have. Then you have the short-term planning view, where the immediate forecasts are really, really important and where they become quite precise from a system operation perspective. So what do you forecast day ahead? What do you forecast half a day ahead? What do you forecast hour ahead? And how do you allow both the system operators, but also the stakeholders in the market, so the investors themselves, which they obviously can leave to somebody else, to update their forecasts and balance their portfolios. Because this ability has been really, really important in Europe with the well-functioning day-ahead, intraday, and balancing markets. And you're seeing in Europe that they're actually going towards shorter timeframes, which you're also seeing in India, and with integrated balancing markets and products across Europe. And that then comes to the point that you so expertly made around integration. So it's not just cross-border integration between sovereign nations, because India is a Europe all on its own. So making sure that states can properly trade together and you can properly use the transmission lines between states is going to be really, really important to make sure that the power system functions. But it's also very important in terms of providing the right signals. Because one of the things I actually did when I was managing wind was that I piloted a project where the wind turbines themselves acted in the balancing markets to actually shut down and so on and react to the power system needs. Where you normally think, well, that's a job for the thermals. Well, if we go to a situation with very, very high renewables penetration, it's suddenly not the thermals necessarily who's going to deliver all this. It can be the renewables, and it will also be the interconnection, so the transmission, where renewables in other states, or for example, hydro can deliver it. And that makes me come to Norway, obviously, as well, because before connecting to the UK, Norway has been a very, very instrumental part in the Danish energy transition, being one of the countries that has the highest penetration of wind, because Norway does act as a battery, so to speak, for Denmark, with their reservoirs and hydro. So to that extent, it's really important for India both to integrate with within India, the places that have hydro, but also to the neighbors such as Nepal and Bangladesh. Obviously, that brings another type of climate risk that you need to look at, which is obviously the hydrological situation, which should not be neglected. But you see systems like Brazil having real problems with drought. Their system is highly based on hydro, but they're starting to turn to other renewables and thermals as well because of drought situation. Coming back to the investor side, I think the PPAs in India are both a good and slightly barrier to the investor side, because one of the things that you see when you have a very dynamic pricing in the wholesale markets, if you have a situation where you have a country that's very, very dependent on wind and the wind is very low, then the price goes very, very high. So the revenue is not as affected because it's volume times price. On the other hand, if you have high wind months, then the price goes low and even negative, which then decreases the revenue, obviously. And that kind of acts as a stabilizing mechanism all on its own when you look at the wind resource variability in itself. Obviously, for investors to get bankability and so on, they need revenue stability, and you can always discuss what kind of financial instruments you can deploy to get both. But I will say that when you have older turbines, that's kind of something that really stabilizes their revenue stream. Obviously, they will also be less debt heavy when they're older. On another thing, one of the things that I worked on when I was trading was weather derivatives. And here you're going into really, really complex financial markets that are not at this point relevant for India, but it's still worth noting that weather derivatives, where you actually do insurance on wind speeds, can also be an instrument to secure this. And I know the big institutional investors in Europe are looking to this risk because if they don't have a portfolio that diversifies the risk of weather, then this is an option to do this. And some of the big banks will actually offer these types of products. Obviously, given that there's no forward market for electricity products right now in India, this is a very, very exotic, very, very out there product. But I just wanted to mention that that is actually something that the big investors, institutional investors in Europe are looking at. And then obviously making sure that everybody has aligned incentives on the day-to-day forecasting is extremely important to make sure that the system functions going forward. Yeah. I think obviously as a data-driven agency, we would advocate as much as possible for transparent data sharing, because that is the primary and most efficient way that we all can learn from each other and make sure that the problems that we face in clean energy transitions are adequately understood. Because before you understand what the problem is, it's really, really impossible to find the solution. So I think I'll leave it there.
Excellent. A couple of points you've made are at least issues on which CEW is already working. You know, you talked about deeper climate risk analysis and using the climatological models. CEW is actually developing the first climate risk atlas for India, which will be the first of its kind in the developing world at a high resolution level. And so district by district, we should be able to understand what's going on. But already we are seeing, 40% of India's districts are showing trends of moving from being flood prone to drought prone and vice versa. And that's historical data, and historical data already is not as good enough to predict the future. So that climatological work is critical. The other point about weather derivatives, it might not be as exotic as you suggest. One of the things that CEW Center for Energy Finance we are trying to develop is something called a grid integration guarantee. And that, of course, when we started working on it, it wasn't the expectation that wind speeds would drop or solar installation would drop. The idea was, if there are policy uncertainties, the grid doesn't absorb, then what does the developer do? Is there an insurance product? The problem is still the same. The electron is there and no one is there to take it. Or in this case, the electron is not there, what I promised to sell, right? So on both sides, on the supply and demand side, some kind of derivative product might not be too far out into the future. But you, Mr. Jain, Dr. Balraman, have all asked for more data. So let's turn to Vibhav. Your business is increasing, Vibhav. So here's the question for you. Short-term forecasts, of course, easier. But what we are looking at now, Dr. Balraman talked about, 10-year moving averages. Mm-hmm. We are talking about quadrupling our current wind capacity to the point we are in 2030. And even that will be nowhere near what India's or South Asia's wind potential is. So how do you go from better short-term forecasting to more accurate medium and long-term forecasting? Because that's the demand.
Right. So, these are if you look at it from a data analytics point of view, these are really two completely different problems, right? Short-term forecasting is really addressing, like Randy mentioned, day ahead, half a day ahead, hour ahead, and in our case, 15 minutes ahead. And like Mr. Jain mentioned, that the consequence of the forecasting and the errors that you observe on a day ahead basis, there are consequences both for grid operators in terms of how they are able to use and plan for their the power to be utilized, and a very non-trivial consequence for investors and project operators, where you see a significant cost potentially, at least on the incremental unit. So that is something that we are already in, that environment we are already in. There are kind of various aspects to it, but at a broader level, India is very unique in the world where that deviation is now priced, right? So individual projects have to, in a way, pay for the deviation that is occurring. There are arguments about how much that payment needs to be, how it needs to be adjusted, because today we are talking of a 50 paisa, 1 rupee 50 paisa per unit deviation, or the deviated unit, which adds up to a few paisa per unit over the entire project over the year. So there are questions about what is that right price for deviation, but at least the first step has been taken in terms of there is a cost of deviation which the investor or the project operator is paying today. So that's kind of unique, right? How do we go from there to a good medium and long-term project projection is the very first thing, and I'll echo everyone here, is just a lot more data is needed. And I'll actually go there. I'll kind of go a step further and say there needs to be even strong incentives for good data infrastructure. So, you will see a lot of the well-run pension fund backed or professional investor backed projects will still invest in good quality SCADA data, good quality meter data, but a lot of our older infrastructure does not have that. And in fact, one of the things we have been doing as part of our forecasting scheduling services is installing meters or data infrastructure. But if we can do that, and if we can create good incentive for extensive data infrastructure, I think that's really the first step, because we do need, even as forecasting regulations have come in place, we have, say, last 3-year, 4-year project level 15-minute data. How do you extrapolate from that to a good medium-term, long-term forecast is a difficult leap today, just because historical data may not be very reliable. But one of the things we can do is for projects and for investors and government agencies to invest in a lot more better quality data. But I think a important step there could be just better incentives for project developers to build good quality data infrastructure and also then share it. The sharing bit is again, has challenges in terms of how do you go from project level data to larger aggregate site level data, etc., etc. But yeah, I think we're some a few steps away from that. And at least the way I see it, in terms of the cost element of the costing of deviation today acts as some incentive to start building better infrastructure, because you can look to say, how do I go from my 2 paisa per unit deviation to 1.5 paisa per unit deviation at a project level? And one clear answer is better data quality. So there is already an incentive because there is a cost, but how do we take it to a longer period is something one has to work on. Yeah.
Okay, so we have 25 minutes left. Thanks, Vibhav, and thanks Disha and Jay for continuing to answer the questions. But I do want to get through two big themes in the remaining time we have. One is on data, and the second is on contracts and regulation. Right. So let's get these two rounds, the next two rounds, a little faster. But my question to all four of you now, including Dr. Balaram, let's take this data issue, right? We all agree that we need more data. And we've all heard this word sharing, but treat me as the outsider who is a fool and has dreams of an idealistic world. So tell me, what kind of data will remain proprietary and what kind of data can be shared, and how would you go about building that architecture that Vibha was talking about fairly quickly? What does NIWE need to do? What will wind power associations do? What will analytics firms like Vibhav's do? And what can the project developers do? Let's bring these four actors together and let's construct for our listeners here that data architecture. Dr. Balraman.
Thanks, Annabha, for initiating a good discussion on this particular one. Let me talk about our NIWE part. We already started working on collecting the wind speed data at a critical locations where we installed a wind mast, and for the last 4 years to 5 years, there are a few locations we are considering getting a data. And that's a trend we already started. We also wrote our ministry to start working on that. That's one area we have started working. The other area we are trying to talk about is to get the data, whatever data available, try to synthesize that. It may be a generation data, it may be wind speed data, the wind speed data, the nasal, and whatever the data is available, we can start ensembling that particular one so that we can start looking into a pattern. Because at the end of the day, when you're trying to talk about any forecasting and other things, we are trying to talk about the pattern also. So this is another exercise we started. And the third part of it, since we already have signed an agreement with all the weather forecasters in the country, IMD, NCMWF, and ISROSAT, and also with the IIT Pune. So where we are trying to get the weather model data. From there, we are trying to synthesize the wind data. In fact, our forecast accuracy is going up to 95% on the intraday level, and also on the day ahead, we are going up to 90 to 92%, because we produce at every point of time, every 15-minute cycle, at every grid point, we produces roughly 49 to 50 forecasts based on the 4 different data samples what we are going to get it. And from there, we are going to get it. Why I'm saying this very clear, it's not just we are trying to look in only the wind and solar data, but we have to partner with the weather agencies also to get the data from there. Not just we're talking about Indian weather agencies, but also across the world we are trying to talk about. So from there only we can get a better forecast. And moving forward to the medium term, long term, we already initiated this particular work to start working on to go for a medium term. In fact, we have few researchers to start working on this particular aspect of it, where based on that abstract, I use the word is the version 0.0, or I can talk about minus 1.0, because if we started the work with that particular work, we could say very clearly last year, yes, we could predict the wind speed is coming down. This year, we said the wind speed is going to pick up a bit early. So both the predictions, again, it's like a toss. Sometimes you're always going to win, sometimes you will be losing. But this is a kind of a gambling kind of a thing which started in the forecasting. But taking the result moving forward, and we need to start structuring this particular aspect of it, so that we need to create a center of excellence in the data analytics as well as forecasting, on which we already taken initiative. But only point we are trying to talk about is like Sunil Jain talking about is many of the investors and many of the developers think every data is confidential. So how to come out with some of the data, at least the generation data, and at least the wind data, what is there in the particular wind farm. Those information is available, we can start constructing the models.
Okay, so Mr. Jain, how does the industry respond to that concern that, if every data is treated as confidential, then how do we build up that sort of public good of better data?
No, I don't think so. There is any confidentiality about the data which you've already generated. Government knows what you're generating because they're paying for it. The question is how the generation is combined with the wind speeds. Every wind turbine has got an anemometer which records the wind speed. Every turbine, even if it is wake affected, but it is a data point. So if that wind speed and the generation data are both provided to an organization like POSOCO or to NIVE or whatever it is. Let government decide on an organization. And that has to be done online, or it can be captured online. I believe that is the best way to analyze and compile the data to come out with a, future predictions. Just one more point. In Europe, when you put up a wind farm, used to, I don't know now, because more commercial the wind farm became, people started cutting costs. It was mandatory to put up a wind mast, which will become your reference wind mast, even for your power curve test. It was very important. That wind mast used to be very important. And that would remain there in that position for life of the project. You may change the sensors, you may change whatever you have to, but that wind mast will remain there.
Right.
That does not happen in India. Very few. In fact, I've done it in my organization, and I was being criticized that because you're a CEO, you have taken a decision, but you have spent 2.5 crores just keeping that wind mast on. You have to pay the farmer for that lease rent. You have to change the sensors. You have to do a lot of things. But at the end of the day, that's a gold mine of a data. So one, that is partially wind wake affected, not fully. A turbine data is wake affected. So we as a country, and MNRE as the regulatory body, whatever you want to call it, has to come out with guidelines clearly. You have to provide, and I don't see why the investors and developers will not provide. It is for everybody's good. My only concern here on the data is, and where Arunabha Ghosh team has to come and play a role. Dr. Balraman talks about 100 years and 50 years data. I want the current data to be, manipulated is not the right word. I want the current data to be adjusted from a decade where we saw very visible patterns of climate change. All this wind patterns is definitely an impact of climate change. So you would know that from the 70s or 80s, we could see visible changes in the pattern. Now, from that time onwards to the current data, you should adjust the wind speed data and then predict. Maybe you want to put in a uncertainty element into your prediction. Fair enough, do that. But your regression line should take into account all these things. So what is happening is the years before 80s did not have so much of a climate impact. And therefore the data was actually good. Wind speeds were good. And if you correlate everything and then say, okay, may not be the right data point to start with.
Right. Thank you. No, that's exactly why this climatological work is so critical. But Randy, you were nodding your head when Mr. Jain was talking about these wind masts. So again, if you look at the European data architecture, is there something that we could be borrowing and learning from to start putting in place those foundations for India?
Yeah, so the reason why I was nodding a lot is because these wind masts actually mean that Europe has a very, very detailed map of wind resource, and that is very up to date and keeps updating, which means that investors have quite a data set to start to evaluate your business case. So I do think that that is a very, very important feature. I will also say something different. I think you need to look at data in terms of timing and availability. So I think it's really, really important that every producer provides more or less real-time data to the system operators. And the system operators in that sense have a good visibility on what's happening in the system. From there, the system operators, because they're independent, they don't have assets, so on, they can start to publish data with a certain lag and with a certain aggregation. So one of the things personally I found very, very useful when I was operating in Europe and balancing wind was to say, okay, I can see that the system operators publish their forecasts. So I know kind of what are they expecting. I can also see that with an hour's lag that they're actually publishing what is the actual wind production, which is super, super helpful. And yes, you should not give everybody access to per assets real-time data. That's not what I'm asking. But there is aggregation that means that you protect the asset owners while still providing a lot of information for the system to be able to maneuver and try to operate the system most effectively. And here I'm not just talking about the system operators. When you have high penetration of renewables, you need everyone to work together. And to do that, these types of data things are really important. And I think that these types of system operators can play a real role in the data architecture for that.
Excellent. Vibhav, we've heard different components of this from Dr. Balraman, from Mr. Jain, and from Randy. So what else is missing in this data? Because if we can even, of course, we can keep refining the analysis, but the point is not about the analysis. The point is to solve the problem.
Right.
So what else is missing that we can say go to the ministry with and say here's an alternative data architecture?
Right. So that's interesting, because as forecasting agency, we actually act as custodians of data. And let me describe what that data is briefly, right? It's thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of wind turbines across the country generating, as they generate power, generating data every minute. So even as a company, we sit on terabytes of data. If you add, years of data every minute granularity, right? So we sit as custodians of that data. But we are also a custodian in the sense that a lot of that data is protected by NDAs because our customers and project owners want that, right? But so when you try and answer that question of what is missing, I think there is a general agreement of how, like Randy was saying, how can that data be aggregated and anonymized for the use of, to make it into a public good, right? Is one. I think what's also missing is a good market of data products. So, in that sense, we kind of, as the industry comes together, industry associations, owners come together, there can be guidelines which enable every actor to participate in that market for data product, which then translates into a larger public good. So, a lot of that data can sit in the government's realm, what data that, grid operators have, but also there can be data products, which a lot of people can do. They can add their own analytics to it, but will enrich investor decision-making as we look forward. So I think that market bit is also quite important.
Fair enough. Okay, so in the remaining 12 minutes, or let's say 10 minutes, let's take this other dimension of markets and contracts. Right, Mr. Jain talked about, how the debt servicing is structured. So you lose generation in those critical 4 months, your 12 months gets impacted, even if, the resource evens out over time. Randy talked about the farmers in Europe who put up the windmills. And here's the thing about farmers, you're absolutely right. They because they live their life always on the edge, they are the biggest risk takers, I think, anywhere on the planet. One thing we know about farmers and repayments in India is that debt cycles are also structured around the cropping cycle. Right? So you don't expect farmers to pay off their loans every month. You expect them to pay off a bulk of the loan when they harvest. So is there now, the question to all of you is there a regulatory change needed in the way, so should, first of all, the PPAs be more flexible? Secondly, should some kind of provision be made for the way payments are the frequency with which payments are made? And similarly, where does of course, the financial industry come in? Because, ultimately we depend on the equity investors or the creditors. So are they willing to play around with this variability, even if not uncertainty? And that's perhaps where also comes the question of what are those insurance products to cushion the different actors? So let me, in this case, start with Randy, because I think the European market is perhaps a little bit more advanced on this. So how do we, at a financial level, how do we give comfort to everybody?
Well, first of all, in Europe, instead of a fixed price PPA, a lot of the instruments we're seeing are more contracts for difference to make sure that you kind of top up if you're missing revenue. I will also say that when relating India versus Europe, the problem of actually getting your payment in India is something that is really, really affecting the industry and something that should not be taken lightly, because that is not a problem that you have in Europe, that off-taker risk and the financial health of the discoms, to me, is something you really need to make sure to fix, because if you don't do that, what financial institute will both take on the weather risk and the risk of discoms? Yeah. And so to speak, yes, I do think financial industries have a role to play. As we go into clean energy transitions, products needs to be made more flexible in PPAs and also the debt structuring. But first, I think there's a lot of inherent fundamental structures in India that could help with financial institutions being more comfortable. I think I'll leave it there.
Vibhav, any thoughts? Because you were talking about creating that market for data products. So can that translate into financial flexibility? And where does regulation come in to enable that?
Right. So I'm not sure if I can talk about the financial aspect at a complete project level. I think I'd like to hear Mr. Jain on that. But quick 1 or 2 points there, right? One is, of course, acknowledging, there is this huge structural problem which Randy talked about, which creates all sorts of issues as we go forward. But beyond that, if we look, I had talked about how, the current forecast, current deviation settlement mechanism is unique in the world, that we price deviation, right? So as we go forward, I think a lot of regulatory change and reform there is possible, which will help a lot. So for example, right now, deviation per unit is fixed, but we see a range of tariffs, from the older PPAs being at 5 rupees to new PPAs being 2 rupees. And that just affects everyone differently. So there, markets can play a big role there. And I think aggregators like we have in Germany or in continental Europe can play a big role, where we have balancing systems within the country, within state. And I think that can help a lot in terms of system balancing and bringing down the cost of deviation. So I think aggregators and the regulators and system operators are talking about that. It will be a big change as we go forward. So.
Dr. Balraman, of course, this is not your direct area of responsibility, but just, as you see the industry, where do you see potential reforms possible on the contracting side, on the regulatory side, that can then, again, maybe create a demand for better data, but also give the developers and investors some comfort?
Arnab, I think in this particular aspect of it, I have to say my personal view also, and not what position I'm holding it. No, I want to make a very clear disclaimer on this particular aspect of it.
Yes, we recognize
that. First and foremost, of course, this is a debate I used to have with Sunil Jain, also the same point of it. How we want to take the scheduling and forecasting, whether it's a business or a service. So I have a fundamental difference of opinion on this particular aspect of it. So when you talk about forecasting, scheduling as a business, definitely you're going to go as a gaming, and the data become a precious commodity, and it becomes a secretive in nature, and you cannot expect anybody to share the data. So as long as you keep your DSM would be unique in the country with the invent of APT and other things. But applying the DSM for the renewable energy of 5 megawatts or 10 megawatts, which is not having any kind of significance on the system operation, we're talking about 180 gigawatts of interconnection capacity, what you're having a demand and other things, and we are trying to talk about 350. Question is going to be, whose responsibility is the forecasting? If you talk about any system operator in the world, the forecasting lies with system operator. The system operators will be given very clear incentive. If I talk about classic model of the England market, right from 1988, if I remember right, because I was there in National Grid Company, till around 2000, they used to have what is called uplift. The uplift is a payment given to system operator as a fixed sum of money in a year. But that is to take care of his forecasting differences and unscheduled machines to come into picture because of the focus inaccuracies or any kind of system events. If you want to pay for the focus inaccuracy and everything, it has to be paid from the uplift. whatever the amount is going to be remaining is a profit to the system operator. Suppose if you are going to spend extra part of it, then it's a loss of system operator, because the accountability of system operators is also equally important. So if you try to talk about, again, this is the point of view I want to hold it. The wind or solar, it is not in your hand. It is going to be the variable. It's a vagaries of the nature is going to be there. Yes, you can make a prediction that has to be at a service. We need to come to a common platform to aggregate, make the forecasting and scheduling proper, so that we are making the grid to be safe and secure and reliable. That's the objective, not for making a penalty for the forecasting inaccuracy. That's my point, is my personal opinion as a professional in the grid operation for more than 3 decades.
Fair enough. Thank you, Dr. Bhargava, for your candor. Mr. Jain, I intentionally left the last word to you on this issue. We've got, the sanctity of contract sometimes becomes a variable. The constancy of wind speed sometimes becomes a variable. The predictability of the currency sometimes becomes a variable. So what is constant if you're going to try and get
only constant is the hit to the investors.
So now the question flipped back. If you were in a policy making position, give me 1 or 2 things that we would.
So I'll tell you one thing. Very interesting debate on. Let's take the case of first scheduling forecasting as a regulation. The problem with our formation of regulations has been that we don't change with time. This regulation of scheduling and forecasting needs a complete overhauling now. This is dated. All scheduling and forecasting now has to be done at state level, aggregate state level, not individual substation, farm levels. Nowhere it is done in the world like that. The moment you do that, I think so you are far more better placed in terms of variability. I'm not saying in terms of prediction, but in terms of variability. So that is one thing which we have been pushing CRC from a association point of view, that let us adopt good practices from West, who have far more greater experience than what we have in forecasting scheduling, and we would be better off. That's number one. I would tend to agree with Dr. Balraman that system operator's responsibility has to be there. Today, our system operator's responsibility is zero. Whether it is the state regulator or the regional or POSOCO, anybody. If the chief engineer cuts off the substation, the responsibility of scheduling forecasting is still with me. The penalty will come on me. Although he has shut off my wind farm on his whims and fancies. Now, until unless the system regulator comes into play, these anomalies will not. So what it needs is a total change of regulation, actually. If I was to be in the powers to be to change the regulations, I think so we will just overhaul this system. Please understand, in wind, when you are in low season, your forecasting penalties, DSM penalties could be as high as 8 to 9 paisa. When the speeds are low and you're generating low, the prediction is all the more difficult. So you don't do it at individual farm and substation levels, what we have in India. And then you've got 29 states and you've got at least 18 policies across the country for different DSM mechanisms, different scheduling forecasting, and you have to understand each one of them, that in this state I have to do this, in that state I have to do this. So as she said, Randy said that India is like one complete Europe. So now we are talking of one grid, one nation, which has come out just now. I think that is a solution for all these problems as more and more renewables get integrated into the system. Your renewables is location based, and we know that beyond 8 to 10 states, renewables will not come up. So you need that entire nation to come on board on the grid so that is distributed evenly and the risk to the grid is minimized. Take the case of Tamil Nadu. I have seen it in my lifetime. Tamil Nadu is generating 5,000 megawatts at say 4 p.m. And 4:45 p.m. it dropped down to 50 megawatts. That's the variability.
Fair enough. Okay. We are exactly at the top of the hour, and I do want to close it within a couple of minutes. But I was wondering if my colleagues, Jay or Disha, wanted to comment on anything they've heard, and even Priya, from a sort of, because the role of philanthropy is so critical in investing in these sort of market making things, creating a data architecture, for instance, or even just shining the light on many of these strategic issues that are emerging. So if any one of you wants to weigh in, I'll give you a minute each.
Yeah, you want to go in, or I could just maybe
Go ahead, Disha.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the very insightful discussions. We were actually, anticipating very interesting discussions before the session started. And I think there's a lot more work to be done on this side. So clearly, like, we do not know enough. And I think Dr. Balaraman said, Mr. Sunil Jain also said that and Randy also pointed out that all stakeholders need to come together. So I think what our team would do is get to each one of you to see how, we can improve our analysis further, because we've already started looking at the climatological correlations, and we would definitely like to come back with a more detailed, of course, system operation implications as well as financial impact that it has on the industry, to come up with a solution which suits system operators as well as the industry, and of course a vital role that NIWE would play. So
sure,
that's where I'd like. Thank you.
Priya?
Thanks, Disha. Thanks, Arnaba, and thanks to all our panelists for a really insightful discussion. I think the discussion around sort of data and the importance of data sharing and open data was really music to my ears, because at Bloomberg Philanthropies, data is a really sort of guiding principle of a lot of the work that we support. Mike Bloomberg likes to say, you can't manage what you can't measure. And I think that's something we see across different areas of work. And I think this kind of granularity of analysis that we've seen in this report is that will be coming out is really helpful, but we need much more of this. And it's good to see also the momentum in this space around the different actors who are working on this, and how it can be sort of brought together to really take it forward so that much more data is available for the progress of the system. And on the kind of market side, I think that's also really interesting to kind of consider that ecosystem of actors, as you put it, Arnaba, with the sort of developers, the investors, and the government, and how that all gets connected and tied together. And one of the areas that we're certainly interested in working on at Bloomberg Philanthropies is around supporting and bridge building in terms of the investment into India and emerging emerging economies on renewable energy. And that's also something we'd be keen to continue the discussion on. Thank you all.
Thank you. I still remember the day when Mr. Jain first called me about this issue. It was, I think, in August of 2020, and I happened to be standing in the balcony. It was a particularly pleasant evening. The wind was blowing quite nicely. There was a spatter of rain. And here on the other side of the phone call, Mr. Jain was, quite worried about what is happening. And I part of my brain wanted to say, let me just enjoy the weather. But clearly, the irony is that if you're a developer, investor, you can't take enjoying the weather for granted. Professor Nitin Desai, who was one of the drafters of the Brundtland Commission report, likes to say that climate change does not translate very well into Hindi, because the literal translation is Jalvayu Parivartan, means water, wind change. Or what does water, wind change really mean? So he likes to say, actually, we should say Vatavaran Asantulan, means your ambient, there's variability in your ambient conditions. And I think that's very important. That's a very nice way to think about it, that there is variability in our ambient conditions. And if we celebrate India's renewable energy revolution, I always call it a revolution over the last 2 decades, we should also recognize that some of those low-hanging fruits have been picked now. And if we now look into the future, we have to think not just about announcing more capacity additions, but we have to think about all the other building blocks that are needed. And if the current uncertainties that the wind sector is facing were simply a trigger for a better data architecture and for better regulation, then wind and solar and biomass and everyone else would benefit, because that data architecture could begin to serve, once we know how to aggregate and anonymize, everyone would benefit from it. Regulation would benefit from it. Our aspirations to integrate our grids, not just within the country, but with our neighbors, would benefit from it. So I see this not just a crisis. I see this as an opportunity, and let the variability be tapped in. And may on Global Wind Day, the wind be always on your backs. Thank you very much for joining us today.
And on the lighter side, I hope the wind continues to blow. Otherwise, we need a lot of philanthropies in our wind farms, Priya, you'll have to come and help.
Well, thank you. And Disha, if there are any further questions, you can take them offline and please respond to our participants. And thank you so much to all the participants. We still have nearly 150 participants who are stayed on right to the end. So thank you for your commitment. And as I said, may the wind always be on your backs. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.